Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 216. I'm so pleased to introduce you to my friend Janet Boxx today. I've known Janet for almost 9 years now, and she has been a consistent source of encouragement in my life. She has experienced the loss of 3 of her 4 children, and she will be my guest over the next 3 episodes as she shares their stories with us and talks about how God has walked with her as she's wrestled through the unimaginable. In today's episode, we discuss the loss of her son Cole when he was stillborn 32 years ago. We will also get to know her daughters Bethany, Gracen, and Katie and learn about the genetic condition with which 2 of them were diagnosed. I believe you'll be blessed by listening in. Hi, Janet. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Jill. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to our chat. So let's get started by giving you the opportunity to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
I live in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I live with my husband, David, who I've been married to for 37 years, and with my middle daughter, Gracen. And Bentonville, you might know, is the home of Walmart. That's probably what it's most famous for, but in more recent years, also for the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art. My days are really spent, caring for my daughter, and husband, and for taking care of our home. I help facilitate the Grief Share program at our church. And once a month, I speak to a defensive driving course via Zoom conference. And I, in recent years, have been doing some online Bible study for a group of bereaved moms with fellow While We're Waiting mom, Jennifer Coleman. So that's kind of what life looks like here. I like to read. I play around with photography when the opportunity exists. And that's about what life is for me here.
Yeah, you're an excellent photographer, by the way.
Oh,
I always enjoy seeing your pictures on Facebook. You take beautiful pictures of birds, and I enjoy that very much. So you actually have 3 children in heaven, and I'd like for us to talk about each one individually. And let's start with Cole. I would love for you to share his story with us.
Okay. Well, I haven't talked about this a whole lot, but Cole was conceived in 1991 following a period of infertility. And he was conceived with the help of a medication called Clomid. I kind of had a front row seat in the pain of infertility. I had a brother and sister-in-law who really struggled with that. And so I saw how comments could be hurtful. And so that, and the fact that at the time in 1991, it's kind of around the time when the septuplets were born, there was a lot of conversation in the church about whether you should use that kind of medication. And so David and I am a very open person, but David and I really didn't talk about that with anybody. Sure. And I would say years later, people didn't know. And I really only mention it because it was an added dimension to my grief later on. However, what happened is I took the medication and we conceived, and everything was going great until about the last month of my pregnancy. And at that point, baby's movement's slow. I had no clue what was going on. And Braxton Hicks contractions kind of started. I really struggled to identify his movements from contractions.
Sure.
I remember going to the nurse practitioner And she said, "You're having a contraction. Can you feel that?" And I was like, "No." And so it was shortly after that, my office had a baby shower for us. And a friend after the shower asked if she could feel the baby move. And, we didn't know whether we were having a boy or a girl, but, we poked and prodded around, and Cole was just not responsive. And I just assumed he was sleeping. But then the following day, we were out shopping, and I told David, I'm just not sure he's moving. And, I tend to worry about things. David's like, you just, you're just paranoid,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we went home, and I got some apple juice. We got some apple juice on the way home, because that's what the childbirth classes recommended. You drink that, you wait a half an hour. The high sugar content should make the baby move. Well, I did all that while he took a nap. And then he didn't start moving. So I called the doctor, and they were like, immediately come to the hospital. And so when we got there, they kind of strap you up to machines, listen for a heartbeat. They couldn't find one. They brought in a sonogram machine. And the doctor looked at it, and she said, I'm going to order a better machine, or I'm going to bring a better machine up. And she left the room, and David and I prayed. And I can't remember the content of that prayer, but I assume it was that everything was okay with the baby. And the nurse had left the room, and I think she'd floated in during that time. And after we prayed, she came in and she said, "I just want you to know the doctor didn't order this sonogram to give you hope, but to confirm her diagnosis." And that's how we were told that they thought our baby was dead.
Wow.
So the next day, they induced me. They did some prep work the night before, and induced me. And in that evening, David had gone home. And the nurse said to me, "The Lord I serve doesn't make mistakes." And I remember thinking, that was such a brazen comment to make to a hurting mom.
Yeah.
But I think she said that because she'd overheard our prayer, and she knew I was a believer. And as much as it hurt to hear that, I knew that that was true. It didn't make it easier, but I knew that it was true. So he was delivered the next day, which was June 21st, and it happened to be Father's Day. And it's kind of the story of Cole.
Yeah. So, how was your faith impacted by the loss of Cole?
Well, I didn't stop believing,
Mhm.
but I really realized that there was lots I did not understand about the Lord.
Right.
His ways are higher than ours. But it was really difficult. And we were working with the youth department of our high school at our church, and I felt very much under the microscope. I was a little bit in a fishbowl, and I really wanted to live out my faith. So I put some pressure on myself there. But there were also family members and friends and colleagues, some who were believers and some who were not, who I was very cognizant that I was being watched. And that made it really hard to work through some of those issues. And, the why question was a big deal. Why allow the pregnancy in the first place?
Yeah.
If he's just going to pass away before he was born. And eventually I laid that to rest by when I realized that even if I knew why, it wouldn't make it hurt any less.
Right.
But I mean, it was hard. And I will say, the youth sent a card, and I really needed to know where scripture said that my son was in heaven. That was a huge deal for me. And people will say, "Well, he's in heaven, he's with the Lord, blah, blah, blah." But it wasn't good enough to hear their opinions. Even if it came from a pastor, I needed to know where it said chapter and verse.
Right.
At the same time, I felt I was extremely vulnerable, and I could not make myself ask somebody. And this card that the youth sent, there was a young lady who'd written the scripture where King David says that his son would not return to him, but he would go to his son. And at the time, I thought, what a horribly hard thing. You've got all this grief and you're receiving things and interpreting things through this lens of pain. I did not recognize it for what it was. And it was probably 6 months later when I reread that card. I still have every card I received.
Yeah.
And I reread that card and I thought, oh my gosh, the answer was here all along. And I just spun my wheels and spun my wheels for forever.
Yeah.
But this was the thing that, really gave me peace. It was like, I can trust in this. And that was really helpful to me.
Mm.
But, oh yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of, it's hard to look back 10 years now and to be able to separate what I learned after Cole as opposed to what I learned along the rest of the passage of life.
Right.
I do remember specifically, those kind of things.
And how many years has it been since Cole was born?
32 years.
32 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you still miss him every day, don't you? You wonder what life would be like if he were here.
I don't go down that road very often.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I don't, because one of the really difficult things for parents of stillborn children is all the unknowns.
Sure. Yeah.
I knew what his hair color was. I knew he had 10 fingers and toes. I knew his height. I knew, his length and his weight, right, the time of his birth. And that's basically it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I knew what caused his death. And, that was a trauma in and of itself. I don't suppose I said earlier that it was a few days after I'd come home from the hospital and my mom had made a comment. I'd been at her house the Thursday before the shower and before he was delivered on Sunday. And I'd said, the baby's moving really funny. I'd forgotten all about that. And she said something about it. And that's when I realized I felt him strangled to death and I did not do anything. So, grief is about reconciling your faith, but it's also about all of the things that take it, like ding your self-esteem.
Yes.
It's like, I wasn't smart enough to figure this out. It didn't cross my mind that my mom wasn't smart enough to say, we need to call the doctor. And she had 4 children.
Right. Yeah. As a first-time mom, you wouldn't know.
Yes.
There's no way you could know.
Yeah. But it was horrible to realize that I was feeling him thrash as he fought for his life. And some of that was, dealing with God about those kind of things. And, I didn't really find an answer that I was ever comfortable with about why the Lord would let something like that happen until not necessarily the means of his death, but the fact that he died before birth.
Right.
That was after we lost the girls, and it was based upon some Christian fiction I read. So you can get messages from the Lord in a lot of different places.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So after Cole, you went on to have 3 beautiful daughters. What was your experience like with pregnancy after loss?
Pregnancy after loss was really difficult. At least particularly for the first pregnancy.
Yes.
One, there was just getting over the hurdle of being willing to try again. There was wrestling with the issue of whether or not I could actually get pregnant. Yeah. This was something nobody knew and we didn't talk about. And, whether or not I was still as confident that it was okay with the Lord that I used fertility drugs. And, basically choosing to have another pregnancy came down to choosing to not prevent another pregnancy.
Right.
And fortunately, I never needed fertility drugs again. So I did not really have to confront that issue. And I'm grateful for that. But, there was also this idea that I kind of rebelled against, that another baby was going to fix this, and I knew right away that there are no replacements. Cole has his own place in my heart. He will always hold that position. And I'm a firm believer that our hearts expand to love new people, but they don't just eject people out.
Exactly. That's right.
Nobody overlays their position or takes that slot. So I had to kind of get beyond that point. But then also just the stress. It was comforting to know that the doctor said, every subsequent pregnancy will be considered a high risk pregnancy, even though we know what caused his death, and that's very unlikely to reoccur. Mm-hmm. They were telling me basically that there's issues that stress can cause that can hinder a successful pregnancy. And I just really wasn't prepared to even think in that vein. But it was comforting that they were going to watch closer. They did like non-stress tests. They called them, or stress tests. You count babies' kicks. Mm-hmm. And we did that in the last trimester of my pregnancy. But even so, the stress was such that I started preterm labor, I think around 34 weeks. And so we went to the hospital and they decided to put me on a drug that would prevent that. And I took that up until 38 weeks when they deemed that the baby's lungs would be fully developed. They could survive outside the womb. And then I think a week later, Bethany arrived. But yeah, it definitely takes a toll. Sure. And I will say that, there were things we did. We didn't tell anybody I was expecting until I was starting to show. I did not want to be in that fishbowl any longer.
Yeah.
And I did not want to deal with people's pity or gossip if we would lose again. I preferred to do that by myself. We didn't call anybody when we went to the hospital, which was pretty common in that day. You call your family. Some of them would show up at the hospital and, they'd wait for the...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we weren't doing that. And we didn't put up the crib. I had the things we got at previous baby showers, and that was about it. Yeah. And David put up the crib after Bethany was born.
Wow.
So I was not going to count my chickens before they hatched again. Mm-hmm. And I never, ever went and told family. We kind of made a production about telling people we were expecting Cole. I never told family again. David went by himself and informed family every time I was pregnant. I couldn't deal with the untempered excitement. They all just assumed everything would be fine. Sure. And I could not go there. That stressed me out more than it encouraged me, because I needed someone to acknowledge that things don't always work out. Right. And it's okay to be afraid, Yeah.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
You can't unknow past experiences.
That's right. That's right. So your girls are Bethany, Gracen, and Katie. I love all of their names. Help us get to know them a little bit.
So Bethany was just a little busy girl. If there was a room of toys, she'd pick something up and play with it for a minute and drop it and go to the next thing. And she loved to read. She liked music. She really enjoyed spending time with friends as she got older. And she was loyal to her friends, and she had great empathy for others. She was a good student. In her later years, she was a good student that didn't apply herself all the time, and it was reflected.
Sure.
But she was just really smart. She just had great critical thinking skills at a really young age. It just astonished me. She loved science. She wanted to be a doctor. That's what she initially started working towards when she went to college. That girl could argue her way out of a paper bag. I thought she should be an attorney.
Uh-huh. That's what I was just thinking. Sounds more like an attorney than a doctor.
She had no interest in that. I think television, like ER, was pretty popular then. I think it romanticized the doctor. Yep. And of course, she loved science. So math was really her nemesis. But But really, she was a really smart kid. She was not afraid to voice her opinions. She won the Honesty Award, Character Quality Award when she was a kindergartner. I hadn't really noticed this about her, but her teacher called and said, she will tell you the truth, even if it will get her in trouble.
Wow.
And I found that years later, she wasn't that sneaky. If she didn't agree or whatever, she would tell you to your face. And sometimes those things hurt, but also you always knew where you stood.
Yeah.
And that was really a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
She accepted Christ as her savior when she was 6. Then she began trying to make her faith her own when she was about an 8th or 9th grader.
Mm-hmm.
And because she was a really critical thinker, she saw when people didn't walk the talk.
Yeah.
They didn't behave like believers. And it seemed to not be a reflection of them, but as to the validity of the faith later.
Right. Okay.
But then also, she had so much empathy for people. And, there were all these moral issues of the time. We talked about abortion at some point. And when she was young, she had really firm beliefs. She could distinguish those things. But as she got older and she was emotionally connected to people and had empathy for them, that was harder. And, the real issue became the LGBT issue of our day, and the biblical stand on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really hard to watch this developing. I always kind of believed that, I know that training up a child in the way they would go is a proverb, not a promise,
Yeah.
And let me make the point, the distinction that 9 times out of 10, if you teach somebody this, they're going to fall back to that. And that's what I mean by a promise. Proverb
Yeah.
is a promise. Mm-hmm. So I always kind of felt like, given enough time, given some, maturity as she grows, that the Lord would draw her back around. But by the time that she was a sophomore in college, really just before her death, she had declared herself a secular humanist on Facebook. And she made the comment to me a week before she died that she believed that Christians were the immoral ones because they believed they could tell people who they could love. And I just felt like, oh, the words from Revelation, in the end times, right will be called wrong. And it was just like that was echoing in my mind. And yet I kept saying to myself, give her time, give the Lord time. This is a marathon and not a sprint.
Right.
Unfortunately, I was not blessed with the time to see that.
Right.
The Lord transform her heart, renew her mind, and that will always be a big heartbreak for me.
Mm-hmm.
Gracen, she's just always quieter in nature. I think she takes more after her dad than her mom. You can tell by the rate at which I talk that Bethany probably got some of that from me.
Sure.
But pretty much from birth, she was just kind of laid back. She loves to read. She plays games on her iPad. She really enjoys photography. Photography was a boon for us because it gave me something to do with my daughter that wasn't related to caregiving.
Yes.
And, directing or parenting or whatever. It was just an activity we could enjoy together. She's a bit sassy. Where Gracen or where Bethany would tell you, write out what she would thought, Gracen tends to hold her opinions to herself, keeps her own counsel. She would be more the passive aggressive child in terms of more sneaky. You tell me not to do that, fine, that's okay. I'm just going to go off and quietly do it. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. I'm just going to, go my own way. So they were really polar opposites in that way. She really soaks up everything around her. She always surprises me with her assessments of like politics you may hear on TV, of the way friends and family interact. She's just picks things up. Her friends over the years have always tended to call her for counsel.
Mm.
With cell phones, she's around and I can hear at least part of the conversation. I'm always really impressed with the advice she gives to other people.
Yeah. That's a high compliment,
Yeah.
when you're that person that your friends call like that. Yeah.
Yes. She's really tenacious. If she sets a goal, she's going to achieve it. Because of some of the health issues she has, those have really affected her life. Sometimes she makes wise decisions in how she goes about it, sometimes not so wise.
Uh-huh.
But it has been really enjoyable to watch her meet those goals. And she's also, her health has caused her to be more compassionate towards other people and patient with
Sure.
people. She's
Yeah.
really patient. And one of the things I really am impressed with is she has learned contentment. And in my own life, I have found that that's a really difficult thing to learn.
Yeah.
So I'm really impressed with that. It's hard to be in her position. And so I think it's a big achievement.
Absolutely.
So now Katie, she was just a happy kid. Actually, Bethany's middle name is Joy. And I always felt like we misnamed her, and Katie should have had that.
Uh-huh.
She was happy to be a part of anything that was going on around her. She didn't even have to be in the thick of it. She was happy to be on the fringe, you know. And she had this really bright, infectious smile. She had a friendly nature. She had an amazing imagination. And she would, well, like when she was kid, if she was sitting in her high chair, she'd split her Pop Tarts apart and start imagination play with each half of the Pop Tart.
Oh.
She also, like her favorite toy was a Blue's Clues notebook. And, when she was like 2, she'd be scrunched up in a corner, just scribbling away. Who knew what was going on there?
Yeah.
As she matured, she wrote poetry and she tried to write stories. One year she wrote poems for the month of everybody's birthday and gave them as gifts for their birthday. And, she just had this zest for life. She loved chocolate chip cookies and mashed potatoes and hamburgers and birthdays. And she was so excited about her own birthday that, like, the day before her birthday one year, I said, Katie, do you know what day this is? And she says, what? And I said, it's Katie Eve. It's the eve of your birthday. And it kind of became a family holiday. So we always talked about Katie Eve. She also had health issues. She shared those with Gracen, but they didn't really, well, the degree was different, but they didn't really prevent her from interacting with people. And she saw people. She saw what they needed. She had a friend. She got extra time to walk to class. And she had another friend. And she said, Mom, I'm walking Catherine to class because I don't have to be on time and I don't want her to have to walk alone.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And later, Catherine ended up in a wheelchair. And I don't know why. This chair was huge. And she was just a teeny tiny little girl. But Gracen or Katie would help push her in her wheelchair.
Wow.
And, Katie did a lot of falling. And she got so used to me saying, are you okay? That she'd fall and all of a sudden I'd hear her yell, I'm okay. And so that's one of the things I miss is hearing her say that. But, she was kind and she had a really simple faith. She would come home and say, Mom, would you pray for this person? Because of her faith, it was easier to lose Katie than it was to lose Bethany. I just did not have that angst. That worry over her eternal future. Sure. And I was confident she was safe with the Lord. But that's my girls.
Yeah. And we can revisit some of those thoughts in a little bit. You mentioned that Katie and Gracen had some health issues. What was the health issue that they were experiencing and that Gracen still deals with?
So from a very young age, like when Gracen was about a year, I started noticing some developmental delays. She was really struggling to learn to walk. She was walking on her toes. When I talked to her pediatrician, they were like, she's going to outgrow this. You're just a little bit of a paranoid mom, was the impression I got, and it was just kind of pushed away. But she continued to struggle and continued to struggle. And for a long time, I just felt like I had this paranoid mom label.
Sure.
Eventually, they recognized something's wrong. We started seeing some specialists. One specialist thought she had cerebral palsy, which at the time, I don't know if this is still true, but at the time they believed that was the result of birth trauma. Only she didn't have any birth trauma.
Yeah.
And then when Katie was born, she started displaying similar symptoms. And actually, it was a little earlier. I noticed it when, how you boost your child up on your hip and you carry them around. Well, most children kind of self-support. But Katie was just dead weight. When you were carrying her, you were doing all the work. It wasn't easy. And, by that time, Gracen had kind of learned to walk, but if you were walking with her, she was holding your hand. She was always pulling on you because she was using your body to balance. Yeah. And so it took 15 years and a lot of tests. Poor Gracen was just a pincushion, probably because she was most affected. And also because by the time she was about 10, she developed migraine headaches. And so we had two issues going on. We didn't know if they were related. So usually she was the pincushion. She was just big, and it was hard. But we finally did a process called whole exome sequencing, and it looks at all the genes and identified that David and I were carriers of a condition called RSACs. And it's an autosomal recessive condition, which means that in order for a child to inherit it, they have to receive an abnormal gene from both parents. So the chance of the risk of receiving it, inheriting it, is 25%. And Gracen actually received 3 mutated genes, and Katie received 2, which is probably why Gracen seemed more affected, physically affected than Katie. And also, some of those mutations were different, and so they presented differently.
Yeah.
But the prognosis was not good.
Yeah.
And so it was just another struggle.
Yes.
And, even the process of getting to that point was a struggle.
Yeah. It's difficult to see your children struggling and not know why. And for it to take 15 years for it to be identified.
You hope that a diagnosis is going to point you to a treatment or a medication, and it's going to resolve it, only to find out that's not the case.
Yes.
Then what do you do with that?
Right.
So that was devastating. I think, prior to that, the migraines were harder because we couldn't resolve them. And that became a real spiritual battle for me. It's like I always knew that the RSACs wouldn't be fixed, but I couldn't accept that she was constantly in pain.
Yeah.
And that there wasn't a medication that was helping.
Right.
And at some point, I just did everything in my power to find help for her. And I remember, there aren't many times where I could say I felt like I heard God's voice, but there was a point where I felt like he said to me, "Why are you kicking against the pricks?" Like he said to Paul, it's just like, this is the way it is.
Yeah.
You will let go of that. And, it was really hard, but to quit striving constantly to fix it, that was eating me up inside.
Sure.
And to have him say, this is it. We're going to live with it together.
Yeah.
I prefer, I was really at that point where it's like, you can do this with me or without me.
Yeah.
It's not like you have an option of not doing it. The option is doing it alone or doing it with God. And my choice was to do it with the Lord.
This concludes the first part of my conversation with Janet Boxx. Be sure to come back next week to hear about the tragic collision that took the lives of 2 of her 3 daughters. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.